So there are different videos addressed to different companies on the internet. There's Dear Apple, there's Dear Google, there's Dear Samsung, and there's even a Dear Snapchat and YouTube. But there are certain things that I want to address to Sony in this video right here. Some very key things to bring it up the smartphone chart and to also make it more favorable to consumers. And these are gonna get pretty steep as we move on from one to another. So number 5 is launch dates. You see, if you've seen a certain pattern with Sony, it's always the fact that they announce their phone at one date and release the phone after a few months. Not like few days, few weeks, or few hours, few months later. And even though this might seem like a small thing, if you remember, along those months, people tend to forget about the phone and the hype quickly dies once you've actually announced the phone, and before it can actually reach in the hands of the consumer, it's no longer remembered. And from that kind of a standpoint, Sony's not going to achieve their initial sales that they have to make those sales figures look good. And from that standpoint, it doesn't look good for a company. And I don't know why it's taken Sony so long to understand this. Because generally, if you take some other company like Apple or Samsung, they actually announce the product 2 weeks before it actually goes on to sale. Then that's the maximum, not more than that. And Apple, on the other hand, yes, if they announce like multiple devices at the same event, they do release them one after the other after like a week or two, so that they all get equal spacing and equal coverage. Sony, on the other hand, Sony only has 1 or 2 events in a year, and those events are really special to them as a company, Sony Mobile. But that doesn't really make the effect on us because of the fact that they leave all these months for the hype to die. But this isn't a proper launch strategy, and Sony really has to work this properly. But although I am pretty happy with what they did for the Sony Xperia Pro I, except for one small thing. Number 3 is that as much as Sony is this professional company, like a company dedicated to professionals and dedicated to like pro users and prosumers, they really need to work on making things look simple and neat. Like many people have already told me their naming strategy kind of sucks, and I have to actually talk about that being not that really complicated, especially in Sony Mobile. But what on earth is WF1000XM4s? Like, what are you thinking, Sony? That is not the way to actually do a naming. And what the heck did you name your charger? Like, just some random alphabets on the keyboard and you call that perfection? No. So Sony really has to work on their naming. I'm fine with their naming. I don't get why people actually rant about Sony's naming in their mobile. But other than their mobile production, everything else kind of sucks. So you might actually think that I'm actually talking about the naming over here, but even the naming, it sounds a little bit prosumer. Unless you're someone deeply inside the Sony universe, you really don't know what Sony makes and what it actually announces as a sequel. So looking from that standpoint, it really doesn't look great for Sony on naming, and not just naming, even on their photos and videos. Like if Sony is actually making certain professional cameras or like professional smartphones, it has to have a consumer lineup for the profits and for the talks, right? But even their consumer-based devices like Sony Xperia 1 Mark III, it's a lot prosumers. Yes, sure, like MKBHD might have said, the headphone jack and the toolless SIM tray, they are not professional stuff, and they're not enthusiast features. But at least from the other stuff, like for example, like the extreme manual control on the Xperia 1 Mark III, extreme to the fact that you cannot bring down the resolution from 4K. And also a lot of other things, like for example, you don't really have that fun camera experience that you have with Xiaomi phones or Samsung phones or even Apple phones today. But the whole point is that Sony, please work on making a proper auto. Like you can't just have telephoto, wide and ultra wide and call it a day with maybe a panorama or maybe slow-mo, that's it. You need to have more fun in your camera, and consumers should really know. As somebody's actually paying like $1,100 or $1,000, they're not expecting some kind of prosumer stuff unless it's a special enthusiast only person who's scouting for your phones, which you already have as a professional set of smartphones where you have the Xperia Pro and the Xperia Pro I priced to the stars. So Sony, please work on making your products more consumer friendly. Now, among the top 2 complaints I have, the number second is ads. And you might think, wait, Sony offers this stock Android thingy with a little bit of a Sony overlay, but so far there's no ads. I haven't seen people complaining about ads. Well, you're right and wrong. So, if you didn't remember, Sony recently announced their so-called Pro I, the $1,800 professional smartphone, and Sony's been pushing that super hard. But pushing that hard isn't a problem. What is a problem is providing ads to people who already purchased a Sony Xperia 1 Mark III, a $1,300 device. Like now, a $1,300 device, while it might be a little bit less value compared to an $1,800 device, but that in itself is no way cheap or anything near to mid-range. Like, that's some proper flagship level cash that you're putting in for a smartphone. And looking at ads in that, people will now really start to reconsider having a Sony phone anymore. Like, people liked how Sony's stock software was, but now that you're actually seeing notification pushed ads, that's gonna bring up some complaints, Sony. Like, you're doing great, you still are doing great, Sony. Just keep the stock stuff. Stop pushing ads over there. Just no, don't push ads over there. That's horrible. And the number 1 complaint that I have, well, it's pretty simple. Pricing. Now, everybody might say, oh wow, why are you talking about Sony having a pricing problem? That's supposed to be an Apple video, right? Actually, no. Sony does have a pricing problem. Not with their $1,800 or $2,500 Pro and Pro I. Those phones are fine. They are niche phones. They're meant to be niche phones. They're meant for the niche market. What I'm talking about is the consumer market, where people are really scoping for the best value that a smartphone can give, and you have to be competitive. And now, I have seen in the past that Sony has actually cut their profits so that they can actually like get some kind of market share and some profit from it. Sure, but I really can't see that in action, because this Xperia 1 Mark III costs $1,300 and people still have many complaints about it. Yeah, sure, that's a flagship. You can't really talk about it. Like, flagships are now $1,600 and $1,500. Sure, that's fine. But what about your Xperia 5 Mark III? Like, the Xperia 5, that's meant to be like this like competitive middle ground between the Xperia 10, which is like a mid-range device, and the Xperia 1, which is the ultra flagship for Sony. At least the proper consumer flagship. So the Xperia 5, although it does have really good specs as I have seen, but the problem is that priced at $1,000 and having only $300 price gap between your ultra flagship option, and as you can see, a lot of other companies' phones like the Samsung Galaxy S21 and the iPhone 13 all being at $799. This seems more like an overpay for a phone that's meant to be sitting in that kind of a bracket. So Sony really needs to work on making its vanilla flagships a little bit more cheaper, because that's the place where the competition is even more fierce, the upper mid-range market. So I don't really think any Sony exec is gonna watch it, but by chance, if you actually watch it, please consider whatever I've said right now, and I hope Sony Mobile begins to take over the smartphone market once again, and someday it'll actually compete a little bit more better with the top dogs Samsung and Apple. On that day is pretty near in the future if Sony actually follows these steps. Until then, this is me, Shreyas Khalyam.